You ever hold an envelope in your hand and just know, deep in the pit of your stomach, that your life is about to take a sharp, expensive, and completely ridiculous turn? That's exactly where I was standing last April, right at the end of my driveway with the humid Georgia heat already sticking my shirt to my back, staring at this cream-colored, linen finish envelope that looked less like mail and more like a summons to the royal court. And I didn't even have to look at the return address to know it was from the Oakhaven Homeowners Association, or as I like to call them, the Shadow Council of Bored Retirees. See, I've lived in Oakhaven for 7 years, minding my own business, paying my dues, and keeping my lawn cut to the regulation height of 2.5 inches. But there's always one person in every neighborhood who thinks the bylaws are a religious text, and they've been ordained by God himself to enforce them. And in my neighborhood, that person is Mrs. Gable, a woman who hasn't smiled since the Reagan administration and who treats her property line like the demilitarized zone. I ripped that envelope open right there in the driveway, ignoring the sweat dripping down my nose, and pulled out a letter that was printed on paper so thick you could probably shingle a roof with it. And there it was, right in the first paragraph, a formal declaration of war accusing me of harboring a blight on the community. They were talking about my fence, my beautiful, weathered, 20-year-old cedar fence that had a few vines creeping up the posts and maybe, if you looked really closely with a magnifying glass, a slight lean to the left near the oak tree. But to Mrs. Gable, who I could see peeking through her blinds across the yard like a sniper waiting for a target, it wasn't a fence, it was an eyesore, a rickety liability, and a direct assault on the median property values of Oakhaven estates. The letter was specific, painfully specific, demanding that I remove the decaying structure within 30 days and replace it with a barrier that was structurally sound, aesthetically commanding, and made of premium, non-depreciating materials. And just to twist the knife a little deeper, they slapped me with a fine of $400 for deferred maintenance, which is just fancy HOA talk for, "We don't like the way your wood is aging." I walked into my kitchen, tossed the letter on the counter, and just stood there laughing. That dry, hollow laugh you do when you realize someone is trying to bully you with paperwork. Because Mrs. Gable didn't care about property values. She cared about control. She wanted me to put up one of those white vinyl plastic fences that look like they belong in a sterile dental office, the same one she had just installed, so our yards would match and her visual symmetry would be restored. But here's the thing about me. I'm a structural engineer by trade. I spend my days calculating load-bearing capacities for bridges and retaining walls. So when you tell me something needs to be structurally sound, I don't think about wood, and I certainly don't think about plastic. I think about geology. I think about things that survive earthquakes and glaciers. I called up my buddy Miller that night. Miller owns a quarry about an hour north of here, a guy who speaks in grunts and measures his life in tonnage, and I told him, "Miller, I need a wall. But not just a wall. I need a statement. I need something that says, I am here, I am not moving, and I am technically compliant with every single word of this ridiculous bylaw." I read him the HOA letter over the phone, focusing on the phrase premium, non-depreciating materials, and Miller just chuckled, a low rumble like a gravel truck starting up, and said, "Mason, you don't want stone, you want basalt, volcanic rock, black as night, denser than granite, harder than spite itself. We just cut some slabs for a billionaire's mausoleum, but I got extras. Basalt, specifically absolute black basalt, polished to a mirror finish. It was perfect, it was excessive, it was aggressive, and most importantly, it was technically a natural material, which was fully approved under Section 4, Paragraph C of the Oakhaven Charter. The plan formed in my head like a blueprint. I wasn't just going to replace the fence. I was going to build a monument to malicious compliance, a structure so over-engineered that archaeologists would dig it up in 1,000 years and assume it was a temple to a forgotten god of petty vengeance. I spent the next week quietly securing permits from the county, not the HOA, because the county only cares if you're building on a utility line or blocking drainage. And since I wasn't doing either, the clerk, a tired woman named Janice who looked like she needed a vacation and a stiff drink, just stamped my papers without even looking up when I listed the material as solid stone monoliths. The morning the demolition crew arrived, Mrs. Gable was out on her porch at 7:01 a.m., clutching her coffee mug like a weapon, watching with a smug little smile as my old cedar fence was ripped out of the ground, probably thinking I was about to roll out the white vinyl she so desperately wanted. But then the excavators showed up, not the little bobcats you use for landscaping, but the big boys, the ones with tracks that shake the pavement. We dug a trench that was 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide, pouring enough reinforced concrete to anchor a suspension bridge, and I saw the smile fade from Mrs. Gable's face as the cement trucks kept coming, one after another, pouring yard after yard of gray slurry into the earth, and she actually walked over to the property line, shouting over the roar of the mixer, "Mr. Verify, excuse me, Mr. Verify. This seems excessive for a fence post footer, don't you think?" I just tipped my hard hat to her, smiled my friendliest, most neighborly smile, and yelled back, "Just following orders, Mrs. Gable." The letter said structurally sound, and I want to make sure this thing stands up to hurricane force winds and the eventual heat death of the universe. She retreated back into her house, probably to call the HOA board, but by the time they could organize a meeting, the concrete was curing and the flatbeds were arriving, carrying the slabs, 12 gigantic, 6-foot-tall, 6-inch thick slabs of polished black basalt, each one weighing about as much as a Honda Civic. The installation was a ballet of heavy machinery, cranes lifting these massive black mirrors into the air, blocking out the sun, and gently lowering them onto the steel pins embedded in the concrete, creating a seamless, terrifyingly beautiful wall of black glass that ran the entire length of the property line, 75 feet of pure, unadulterated no. When the last slab clicked into place, the silence was heavy, heavier than the rock itself, because this wasn't a fence anymore. It was an event horizon. It completely severed the visual connection between my world and hers, and the best part, the absolute cherry on top, was the finish. On my side, it was a honed, matte finish, soft and textured, but on her side, facing her pristine white vinyl and her meticulously manicured rose bushes, it was polished to a high gloss, a literal mirror. I was standing there admiring the sheer mass of it when Mrs. Gable came storming out, and this time she wasn't holding a coffee cup. She was holding her phone, and she was practically vibrating with rage, screaming, "What is this? What in God's name is this monstrosity? It looks like a tombstone. It's morbid. It's offensive. You have turned our neighborhood into a cemetery." I walked over to the wall, laid my hand on the cool stone, and said, "Mrs. Gable, I believe the letter requested a commanding aesthetic, and honestly, looking at this, I don't think you can command much more attention than a monolith. Plus, it's basalt, the most durable material on Earth. It will never rot, never rust, never fade, and you will never, ever have to look at my blight of a yard again." She sputtered, literally sputtered, looking for words that weren't there, and finally hissed, "I will have this torn down. The board will hear about this. You cannot just erect a Berlin Wall in the middle of suburbia." And she stormed off, but the funny thing was, as she turned to leave, she caught her own reflection in the black stone, her red face and wild hair distorted in the dark mirror, and for a split second, she had to look at herself, really look at herself, and she didn't like what she saw. The legal assault began 3 days later, a cease and desist letter from the HOA's lawyer, a guy named Chad who probably billed by the syllable, claiming that my wall violated the community harmony clause and demanding immediate removal of the non-conforming structure. But I was ready. I had my binder, my beautiful binder full of case law and technical specifications. So I went to the hearing, a tribunal held in the community center basement, which smelled faintly of bleach and despair, and I sat there while Chad droned on about aesthetics and neighborly cohesion. When it was my turn, I didn't argue feelings. I argued physics and finance. I stood up and laid out the receipts. $45,000 in materials, $12,000 in labor, permits from the county, and then I pulled out the trump card, their own letter. "You demanded a non-depreciating material," I said, projecting my voice to the back of the room where Mrs. Gable was sitting with her arms crossed. "Wood depreciates, vinyl cracks and yellows within 10 years, brick crumbles, but basalt? Basalt is forever. Basalt is what the earth is made of, by definition. I have installed the only structure in this entire neighborhood that actually increases in value the longer it sits there. So if you want me to tear it down, you are demanding that I actively lower the property value, which is a direct violation of the HOA Charter's primary directive." The board members looked at each other, then at Chad, then at the photos of the wall, and I could see the gears turning. They realized that if they fought me on this, I would drag them into a court battle that would bankrupt their little reserve fund. And technically, I hadn't broken a single written rule. I had just followed them to a psychotic degree. They dismissed the complaint with a heavy sigh, and I walked out of there feeling 10 feet tall. But the war wasn't over, because Mrs. Gable wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was the type to pivot. A week later, I woke up to a strange sound, a rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack coming from the other side of the wall. So I went out to investigate, and there she was on a ladder on her side, hanging things on the wall. My wall. She was drilling holes, actual masonry screws, into my $60,000 custom basalt slabs to hang these tacky, painted wooden sunflowers and a sign that said live, laugh, love. I saw red. I saw absolute crimson, because it's one thing to be annoying, it's another thing to damage structural stone. So I didn't yell, I didn't scream, I just went inside, grabbed my high-resolution camera, and climbed up on my own ladder to take pictures of the damage, the dust from the drill holes settling on her perfectly mulched flower beds. I sent the invoice to her directly, not the HOA, but to her, via certified mail, charging her for the restoration of the stone, which involves filling the holes with epoxy and repolishing the entire slab, a process that costs about $2,000 per slab, and I included a note that said, per the property line survey, this wall sits 3 inches inside my boundary, which means you are currently vandalizing private property. Please remit payment within 30 days, or I will file a police report for criminal mischief. That stopped the drilling, but it didn't stop the pettiness. She started piling her grass clippings against the base of the wall, hoping the moisture would stain it. But joke's on her. It's volcanic rock. It doesn't stain. It just looked like she was building a compost heap against a monument, making her yard look trashy while mine remained an impenetrable fortress of solitude. But the real turning point, the moment that shifted everything from a neighborhood dispute to a legend, happened about 2 months in, when we had that freak heat wave, temperatures hitting 105, humid as a swamp, and everyone's AC units were straining, screaming to keep up. I was sitting on my patio, which was now noticeably cooler because the massive thermal mass of the stone wall was absorbing the heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night, creating this amazing microclimate, when I heard a commotion out front, fire trucks, sirens, the whole cavalry. I ran out to see smoke billowing from Mrs. Gable's side yard, right where she had piled all those dry grass clippings and dead leaves against the wall. Apparently, the sun had reflected off the polished black surface of the wall, creating a parabolic mirror effect, focusing a beam of intense heat right onto her pile of dry tinder, and poof, spontaneous combustion. The fire department put it out in 5 minutes. No real damage to her house, just some scorched vinyl fencing. Her precious vinyl fencing, which had melted into a sad, drooping Salvador Dali painting, while my wall, my beautiful black basalt wall, just stood there, covered in soot but completely unharmed, looking even more imposing than before. The fire chief, a guy I went to high school with, walked over to me while wiping soot off his face, looked at the wall, then at the melted vinyl, and said, "Mason, I gotta tell you, that is one hell of a fire break you built there. If that had been a wood fence, both your houses would be gone." Mrs. Gable was standing there, smelling like smoke and defeat, clutching her robe, staring at the melted remains of her plastic fence and the untouched, stoic grandeur of my stone wall. And for the first time in 7 years, she didn't have a snappy comeback. She didn't have a bylaw to quote. She just looked small. After that, the neighborhood dynamic changed. People started walking by just to see the monolith, treating it like a local landmark. I even caught a couple of teenagers taking prom photos in front of it because the lighting was so dramatic. And Mrs. Gable, well, she planted a row of tall, fast-growing cypress trees on her side to hide the wall, which was ironic because she ended up blocking her own view and creating the privacy I had wanted all along. But here's the kicker, the part that keeps me up at night sometimes, wondering if I'm the hero or the villain in my own story. A few months ago, I was out back, drinking a beer, enjoying the absolute silence that the sound-dampening rock provided, and I heard crying, soft, muffled sobbing coming from the other side of the wall. I realized it was Mrs. Gable, and she was talking to someone on the phone, her voice cracking, saying, "I just feel so invisible, Harold. I try to keep everything nice. I try to keep standards, and everyone just hates me for it. I look out my window, and I just see my own ugly face reflected in that black rock, and I can't stand it. I sat there, beer in hand, staring at the blank, cold face of the stone, and I realized that I had won, completely and totally. I had crushed her with compliance, bankrupt her spirit with granite, and turned her own vanity against her. But listening to an old woman cry about being lonely and hated, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt heavy, heavier than the basalt. I didn't tear the wall down. I'm not crazy. I still have 70 grand tied up in that rock, and I value my privacy. But the next day, I went out and bought a climbing hydrangea, the kind that clings to stone and blooms with big, soft white flowers, and I planted it on my side. Sure, but I trained the vines over the top, so that eventually, maybe in a year or two, cascading flowers would spill over onto her side, breaking up that harsh, black reflection with something living, something soft. It's been a year now, and the wall is still there, unyielding, permanent, a testament to what happens when an immovable object meets an unstoppable force of pettiness. And Mrs. Gable is quieter now. She doesn't patrol the property line as much, maybe because she's afraid of what she sees in the mirror, or maybe because she's just tired. I look at that wall every day, and I ask myself, was it worth it? Was it worth the second mortgage, the stress, the neighborhood feud? Technically, financially, it was the worst investment of my life, a total sunk cost that I'll never recoup. But then I sit there in the evening, in the cool shadow of my volcanic fortress, completely isolated from the prying eyes of the world, and I take a sip of my drink and think, yeah, maybe it was. But then I wonder, if I had just invited her over for coffee 7 years ago, if I had just listened to her complain about the trash cans instead of ignoring her, would we be here? Is this wall a monument to my cleverness? Or is it a tombstone for the possibility of being a decent neighbor? I honestly don't know. Folks, I really don't. But I do know one thing. If you're going to build a spite fence, make sure it's load-bearing, because you're going to have to carry the weight of it for a long, long time. So, tell me, am I the genius who beat the system, or am I just another jerk with too much concrete and a bruised ego? I'd love to hear what you think, because from where I'm sitting, looking at 75 feet of polished black stone, the answer is a little harder to see than my own reflection.